Live from the mist-enshrouded mountaintop fortress that is X and Y Communications headquarters, you're listening to the world-famous Mountaintop Podcast. And now, here's your host, Scott McKay.
All right, gentlemen, in today's episode, we're going to talk about a topic that probably needs to be covered a lot more in a lot different a manner than you've seen it covered. Today, we're going to talk about neurodivergence, and you've seen that word a lot, but what's going to differentiate this show from everything else you've ever heard before is we're going to actually tell you not only what the heck that means and what the difference between ADD and ADHD are and what Asperger's is as opposed to autism, or is it the same or different? And it isn't only going to matter if it's something that you are wrestling with in your own life. We're going to help you identify and manage relationships with women who are so effective. And I bet you've never heard anybody talk about that before. So I'm excited about this. Before I introduce you to my guest, I want to remind you that I am your host, Scott McKay from XY Communications. And this is the Mountaintop Podcast where better men get better women. And if you want to find me on social anywhere except for Instagram, where I'm at Real Scott McKay, it's going to be at Scott McKay, SCOTMCKAY. So onward, let's do this thing. With me today is William Schroeder, and he is from Austin, and he runs a practice that focuses a lot on this. And welcome to the show, William. Glad to have you, man. First-time guest.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. Yeah, I run a practice in Austin called Just Mind Counseling. We have about 50 therapists. My wife and I are both actually clinicians, and yeah, we've been around since 2007, so quite some time.
Fantastic, man. So you are 19 years into this.
Yes, indeed. And neurodivergence is a topic that comes up, and we definitely see it on both sides, and it's definitely been a little bit more of a buzzword in the last few years.
Why do you think that is? Is it because it's gone undiagnosed for so long, or because, the DSM is looking for more things to add to it, or what do you think's going on there?
So, originally with ADHD, we saw this huge explosion that happened in the 80s, especially as stimulants came onto the scene, and pharmaceutical companies were a big reason for that. Parents were looking to try and understand different things happening with their kids. Nowadays, I think truly a lot of it has to do with social media. You look at different things like the Holderness family, and they've gone and had these two slants of perimenopause and ADHD as kind of big things that have been an arc of their substance. And I think it's reflective of the broader culture, especially since COVID happened. More people were at home. People noticed difficulty with their own attention. Then they started looking around for reasons as to why that might be, and kind of exploring what might be different options to help them with attention and focus when they're being pulled in a lot of different directions. And then we've seen a lot of investment in that space from a lot of private equity funded or venture capital funds that are like also pushing stimulants, to be quite frank.
That's a very transparent answer, more so than I expected. And not necessarily that another answer would be right or wrong, but what you're basically saying, if I'm reading between the lines here, is if we're talking nature versus nurture, a lot of this really is nurture.
So there's a mix. A lot of people come in. So one thing that we also do is testing, and we have a director of neurodiversity that's part of our practice. And so there are a lot of people that are coming in because maybe they notice some difficulty with attention. Maybe it's causing a problem in their relationship. Maybe it's actually even a benefit of their relationship. It can go either way, and we can talk certainly more about that too. But there's different ways that it can come up, and then people may wonder, like, maybe do I have a diagnosis? And in the inevitable age of TikTok and Reddit and whatever, people are finding more resources and being like, I took this self-test and I'm realizing I do have a number of these factors. Does that mean that it's actually diagnosable? So people are starting to go further down this rabbit hole to see, like, is this something that truly applies to me? And what are the things that I can do to be able to, overcome some of the different things that have maybe been challenges? Because no doubt within all of this, I think that there's benefits and there's challenges. And that's why personally I look at different people's brains as almost being like operating systems. And there's a saying with like ADHD or autism, when you meet one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. It's not characteristic of everyone to look that exact same way.
Yeah, that would follow my own personal experience in meeting and interacting with people. who are on the spectrum.
Yeah.
Ever since COVID, it just seems like everybody's attention span is a lot shorter. You have microseconds to get somebody hooked into whatever media thing you're doing, including this podcast. Hence why I've started telling guys right up front in these shows what we're going to talk about and why it's going to help them and why it's interesting. For years, that wasn't necessary. Heck, for years, I had a 30-second bump leading up to the first words of the podcast. The intro was 30 seconds. Now I've cut that to almost nothing, especially on the brief ones on Tuesday, because people will turn it off. If it takes more than 2 or 3 seconds to load your website, you need to change your web host because people will be out of there. They'll be gone. So as far as attention deficit, I think, especially here in the Western world, it's almost universal nowadays, and it's creating a lot of issues. Everybody wants to move a lot faster. Everybody wants to be entertained a lot more fully and a lot more quickly. It affects relationships, obviously, because my goodness, William, the apps are obsolete now. That's too messy. I need something even quicker than that. Although the apps shot themselves in the foot, and that's been the subject of lots of shows prior to this. I think where I'd like to go now is I think more than ever before, we need a good, solid definition of what's indeed diagnosable here. What's the difference between ADD and ADHD, and what does that look like? How do we know what it even is? Not only in our own lives, but when we see it in other people. And how does that all intersect with Asperger's? Because I think Asperger's is something that not a lot of people understand. We see Elon Musk. We've seen a South Park episode 15 years ago, but I think above and beyond that, it's easy to create preconceived notions where there's a lack of actual definition. So go ahead and clarify all of that for us right now. I think that would be great.
Sure. And I mean, it's a little bit broad, and I'll try and make it as simple as I can. But basically, ADHD and autism are two basically different splits in the road. And often those two different types of people can work really well together, interestingly enough. But ADHD and ADD, like, it used to be coined very typically as ADD. And now the broader accepted definition and what's in the DSM is ADHD. And mostly people are using in their doctor's office things like the World Health Organization 16-question quiz to be able to go and look at somebody's background and history to be able to then understand, does this person meet criteria for ADHD, which breaks down into two different areas, which are the hyperactive piece, that may be somebody that's kind of impulsive, that maybe interrupts different people. That's what it can present like. The other side is the inattentive piece. And that can be the person that has harder times with the executive function pieces of, maybe losing their keys, maybe it's organizing and planning different things. But basically, that's what that looks like. Ned Hollowell very famously said, people with ADHD can often be, and he's a psychiatrist from Harvard. I should give a little bit of a reframe on that people with ADHD present like a Ferrari brain with bicycle brakes. They're really good with going fast on stuff. They have a hard time kind of slowing down and sometimes spin out a little bit. So that's where other people in their team, their life, or relationships may be. And then autism on the other side, there's always the example of Elon Musk that's given, but I think the better example in some ways is actually Bill Gates. And Bill Gates, as a kid, for instance, he was so single focused on programming that he used to sneak out of his bedroom at night at like 3 a.m. and then go to the university and start programming different cards because he was so singly focused on this that it was all he wanted to do. And it's interesting because I see that absolutely, that presentation, granted, when you meet one person with autism, you met one person with autism, but you'll sometimes find that special focus being a really dominant feature that's there. There's a book called Look Me in the Eye, for example, where he talks about as a kid, his special focus areas and, whether it be trains or different things like that, and knowing more about it than anybody else. Or maybe it's dinosaurs. Like I had a client that was like that when he was a kid, where he knew everything about dinosaurs that there ever was. And it was truly incredible to see that much knowledge, but it's that special focus that can often define that. But it also presents very different in men than it does in women. And certainly we can talk about that later.
Yeah, we're going to talk all about that. One of the things that I've noticed is that something like ADHD can definitely be handled and managed, in the life of one who's affected by it with some maturity. Typically you'll meet 7th and 8th grade kids who are ADHD, and if it's in their brain, it comes out their mouth. And it can be both shocking and invigorating, and indeed also charming sometimes, because they're just so transparent, so out there and upfront with things, and it can be quite entertaining, actually. But as we get out of college and we get into the real adult world and expected to behave that way, it can be, really a liability. So we do learn how to manage this neurodivergence as we go through our lifespan, don't we?
So we do. And so
smart.
Part of it is, part of the challenge is definitely figuring out like compensatory strategies is what we call it.
Okay.
And trying to figure out those different things that work better for you. Because it's truly like the thing that I'll say is there's a variety of techniques that we can use in working with ADHD and autism. But ultimately, a lot of it does kind of come down to customization and knowing that each person is going to have different unique challenges that are in that, and figuring out different ways to be able to work through that. Because that may present, as difficulty with interrupting or things like that. And sometimes that, ties into things in the workplace of like, hey, maybe should I disclose this to my boss or not, to be able to kind of be transparent of sometimes this is a challenge for me. And, please let me know like different ways that, we can work together. Don't take that personally. If I, maybe interrupt or interject with an idea, know that that's not something that I'm meaning to do, or looking for those different things as to how it presents itself. Like for instance, in relationships, I'll say ADHD in men can really be a tremendous asset just because they can hyper focus on that, person that they really do love and care for. And so in that moment, it's like this person, they're like, wow, I have this golden spotlight on me and it's just incredible. And it's really an impressive and enjoyable thing. And people will be like, wow, this person has so much, love and care and devotion. And, it's something that feels very unique.
So you've talked about this intensity of focus in the context of both ADHD and Asperger's right now. I think it's time we simply define the term neurodivergence, because it's in vogue nowadays and a lot of people throw it around kind of glibly. What does that mean?
So neurodivergence ultimately is kind of the umbrella that we've kind of created for the more broad picture of looking at the whole spectrum of minds. And so it's, instead of necessarily saying that somebody is autistic or, is ADHD, and also understanding that the criteria for meeting the different definitions of these things also changes over time. So for instance, you mentioned Asperger's, and that's a term that's fallen out of favor. Part of it is because of Hans Asperger's was found that he was working with people during World War II, and some different people ended
so we canceled the dude, huh?
Yeah, so it was somewhat canceled. And so as a result, also they changed the criteria around it. And there's been certainly a good bit of controversy around that, because some people are like, wait a minute, I totally don't fit into more of a normal, I don't feel like my mind is like everybody else's. It works differently, but I also don't feel like I fit into what's now the criteria for autism. So it can leave people left out. So that can hurt. So if somebody's in school, they may no longer meet criteria, whether it's high school or college or grad school, for being able to get, different benefits associated with that.
Well, it sounds like it would just alienate people on the spot big time. Like I thought I had this figured out. Now I don't know anything anymore.
It's frustrating.
That's
and when
rough.
you look at whether I've had this client feedback from people, or, certainly you can look at it in subreddits and things like that as well. It's frustrating just because people identified with something and then all of a sudden it's like the rug is being pulled out from underneath them, where they're like,
right,
I have these different gifts that present itself and are really, really helpful. And yet there's also these things that may be hard for me. So, and I'll see those different things where it's like, all right, like this person absolutely, maybe their special interest was in dark matter. And yet some of those different social situations are really challenging for them to read people. Like reading emotions is really, really hard. And they also present and maybe in a very flat way. So it can be harder for others to read them, or even possibly they may assume incorrectly what's going on with them.
Well, I think the danger of a term like neurodivergence is it can be either seen as a euphemism or the opposite. In other words, if I hear someone is neurodivergent, I don't know whether to expect the Rain Man or to expect someone who just, has mild ADHD. So, broadening the term, I'm not sure societally if that's going to be as beneficial as we think. What do you think?
I think it depends on who you talk to. I mean, it's like the goal, I think, by having an umbrella of different characteristics and personalities or diagnoses that are under this ultimately is what it is I think to understand, and it's like, I'll say this as a clinician, it's when you, again, meet one person that's on the spectrum, you meet one person on the spectrum. So I do think that as we go through these definitions over time, we're ultimately going to find a lot more segmentation within that, and also interconnection of these different things. It just kind of like you mentioned, you're like, wow, so there's the same thing of hyperfocus that presents itself in like autism or Asperger's, and yet it looks a little bit different with ADHD, but it's a similar thing that can be there. For somebody with ADHD, it's the shiny thing, and it may be a momentary thing, versus very often with autism, it's this very enduring thing. It's like that person may know the history of every subway schedule for the past like 50 years, and all of the history of the engines and the brakes and all the different, like there's just such a level of detail. Like there was an example that I can give from like a book that this kid, for instance, was playing in a playground as a child, and they were like, why is this kid always looking so lost outside? And that kid was absolutely studying the drainage and irrigation and looking at like all of the engineering that went into this playground and like noting all of it. And nobody else had any clue in the world about all of this stuff. All the other kids are just playing and having fun, versus this kid, this became a special focus of his. So it's just noting that those things can present very different. And I do think that ultimately over time, we'll find these areas of overlap and understand that like this world, we have a lot of different operating systems that are ultimately that are going within it. It's not just kind of a Windows versus Mac environment that we lump a little bit and oversimplify it into. And so that's something that's important to, I think, be appreciative of. And I think in some ways with this neurodiverse thing, it's trying to have more broad acceptance around there being these different types of mind and experience. Kind of similarly, we're starting to see some of the stuff around schizophrenia and looking at it as like a schizophrenia spectrum, which has been another area that's also been mentioned.
Yeah, human psychology is largely untapped. We largely still do not understand the human mind. So there's going to be a lot of development, probably pretty quickly, with the
Yeah,
way
I think
science is evolving.
within the age of fMRIs and AI, it's like I think we're going to have a lot more diagnoses and understanding of like what makes different brains function more uniquely. And also broadly understanding more about the brain and the body and the interrelationship between all of it.
Okay, so let's say a guy's listening to this and he either has been diagnosed ADHD or Asperger's, or even this is something we haven't talked about yet, alexithymic. I just don't understand my emotions or even what's going on or how to relate to them. And yet he wants to succeed with women. There may be also guys listening to this scratching their head going, man, have I gone undiagnosed my entire life? Because that sounds like me. Let's set all the labels aside and talk to the guys listening who are thinking to themselves, whether I've ever been diagnosed or not, man, that sounds like me. How is this likely affecting my relationships with women, my ability to attract them, how I run boyfriend, girlfriend stuff? And what are some things I should be watching out for and perhaps mitigating? Because we may think, hey, you know what? I'm just thinking about this, doing things, going about things the way any other guy would, when we really haven't been.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think when it comes to dating, sometimes we find that people that are, let's say, on the spectrum, they may actually attract other partners on the spectrum because they understand that perspective of thinking and way of doing different things. I've certainly seen that come up a lot. And people working within tech companies, inevitably, they find partners that are also very good with kind of the concrete sequential thinking. So maybe that's also where they meet those partners. So the challenge that I can see that comes up, like I'm kind of focusing within autism on that, can be if they have a non-neurodivergent partner, there may be some mystery around their thinking or what's going on. And for instance, Eva Mendes has a book, and it's called Asperger's and Loving Relationships. It was written years ago, but it's still like a tremendous guide. And finding different ways to be able to connect with different people that you are romantic with and that are in your life to be able to help decode that stuff. For instance, like I had a client that he was in a relationship, and in that relationship there had been confusion about like intimacy, like when his partner wanted to have intimacy. So because it wasn't something that was a requirement for him, it was something that was enjoyed, but it was also something that it wasn't always understood, so the signaling actually had to be very direct. So that could look something like putting a, a, a red tie on the door handle and being like, okay, it's tonight, or having candles in the bedroom, or something that's very much of a cue. So that way, you basically know and are cued into that. Just because it's, for some people that's very obvious and maybe very much of a need of theirs on a regular basis. For other people it may not be. And so it's trying to communicate and look through those different lenses of what somebody else's perspective may be, and be curious with that. And with ADHD, that presents a little bit differently.
I want to cut to the chase here. First of all, I want you to talk about how ADHD presents differently. We can't leave that there. But I do want to address the elephant in the room here, which is a lot of guys feel like, hey, if I've been diagnosed with something neurodivergent, it's a death sentence to my ability to be attractive. It's not masculine. It's not manly. Elon Musk has 45 children because he's a 100 billionaire or more. I mean, you could say it's all about the money, right? But I think for most guys, normal, everyday Joe, if he hears he has Asperger's, he might as well have AIDS when it comes to like trying to attract women. And I know that's very harsh, but I also know it's not true. And I think something extremely significant that you said is there are enough neurodivergent women out there who are going to relate to this, that you're going to have a dating pool that's immense already. But I still think guys feel like they're broken. They're damaged goods if they're like this. I don't think it has to be that way. It can be an advantage, can't it?
I think the challenge in it can be, I think a lot of people get frustrated, and people can feel somewhat isolated, and then they can lose their optimism around looking at options. So the challenge is really trying to find a way to then be able to connect with people, because I will say that very often people on the spectrum, and again, you meet one person on the spectrum, you meet one person on the spectrum, it's there can be the challenge of connecting people in a way that taking that romantic risk. And I think it broadly, it's like you look at kind of like what's being talked about a lot in society today too. I think there have been more younger folks that are less open to taking that risk, right? And that is
In
kind of the
general.
challenge in general. Absolutely. And so I think when people on the spectrum come to relationships, the benefit that they have is they have radical honesty. They're extremely consistent. They have very strong ethics. Their commitment, it's truly structural and not casual. And so partners really like love that enduring loyalty that they get from them, and they never question that. So the big thing is being able to make sure that they're tied into each other's emotional world. To me, it's like actually I get the initial problem, but it's kind of like, I don't know, like almost like you're trying to go and have a connector, and you're trying to find understanding that for that connector, it needs to go into the right plug, right? And so it's being willing to, I think, try enough and to go out there and find those different ways to connect. So that could be something like, if you're younger, like a D&D group, maybe it's a working group, and being willing to take a risk and asking somebody out through a work environment, which I think is one of the challenges of today, because so many people are working from home, depending on what they're doing, but especially in technology, there isn't that same ability to go and connect with other people. So you have to find those other opportunities that exist, whether it be through, you know, I'm not suggesting CrossFit to anybody, but like whatever those different like activities and things may be, to be able to go and connect with others, and then to take that risk of saying like, this is a shot in the dark, but would you be open to going and doing this thing with me? And that's why, special interest can be great for that. Like I had a client years ago that um, he met somebody through a D&D thing, and another person that met somebody through an improv group that they were part of. So like whatever those different special interests are, they can be a really great bridge to be able to build and connect with somebody that you may develop a deep and lasting relationship with.
I think it's significant that you said for neurodivergent people, commitment is structural, not casual, because that's almost unheard of in today's world of transactional relationships and disposable partners. So
So
that's huge.
in autism, that is definitely the way that it presents. In autism, it's very much, there is radical honesty that's there, and which is a benefit of it. And it also can be sometimes the challenge of it. Since it can be so structured. So for instance, I believe it was David Finch in his book, he had talked about an example, because he had put together a book called the Journal of Best Practices, I think is the name of it. It's been several years since I've read it. But in it, he had talked about the example of he had been driving in the car and the radio was on, and his wife's observation of what happened was she was singing along to a song that she liked, and he turned off the radio. And for him, he was actually so deeply into driving and noticing the lane markers and noticing that the gapping had suddenly changed. So his brain was on this like very much sequential oriented thing, this process oriented thing that was going on, instead of at all what was happening in the car. And so it's that reminder of all minds are so different. For instance, I had a client one day when I walked out into the parking lot and I was like, hey, all right, I'm going this way. Which car is yours? And instead of being like, oh, it's this red Kia, they were very much focused on the pattern. To them, they only identified their car as the license plate sequence. So it's that reminder of different brains encode things in very different ways, and to always be curious with that. Because for that example with David Finch or Fincher, he absolutely had a little bit of a rupture with his partner, and it was totally because they were in two different modes of thinking. And so it was important for him to then be more tuned into kind of what that other person's reality may be.
I think that brings us to how to identify women who are neurodivergent and how to manage a relationship with them. Because, I mean, hey, we just talked about how it's not a death sentence to be neurodivergent for men, which means we're indeed going to meet women. I mean, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right? We're going to meet women who we're crazy about. They're adorable, they're charming, they're sexy, they're very smart, but they may be neurodivergent. And I think you've already touched on this idea of being intellectually curious about their behaviors and what's important to them and how it makes them feel, rather than simply just taking it as it comes and drawing our own conclusions without ever opening our mouths. That's a huge lesson right there that I think is transferable in the other direction when we're talking to women who are neurodivergent. But first of all, is there anything that's going to be uniquely present, something that presents itself in women that isn't usually the case in men in terms of neurodivergence, just because of how women are? And second of all, how do we manage that? And I don't know whether the right term is make peace with it. If we have this woman we like, rather than saying this is never going to work, she's just mean and awful and nasty and can't focus and I don't like her. I mean, how can we manage all of those things?
So autism and ADHD can present very differently from men to women. And if you search online about it for like autism in women, you can see these different things where they talk about with women, there's more cloaking that happens. So if they kind of put on mask and you won't always guess that autism may be a part of the picture for them. It's not always as easy to find. And I'll say as a therapist, sometimes when it's come up and I've done some different testing with different clients, it's actually truly surprised me. And, sometimes it actually comes up from a client that's done some different research on their own, or they've read an article and been like, holy crap, like, I think this may be me. And then when they get testing, it truly is like this game changer for them. So I think it's the understanding that that's how, say, autism can look. And for ADHD in women, it's like they can present as like quirky and fun and have a lot of different energy. And like the challenge then can come later in relationships for them of the parts of like raising a family and having all these executive function pieces that can be a challenge and can actually have, and that can happen on both sides. It's like dealing with all the structural pieces and planning pieces of like every day I have to help with, whoever's doing dinner, whoever's helping with homework, who's ever planning like outfits for the next day, creating launch pads for the kids to go, like all the different sequencing and planning that goes into running a family. And those same people can be tremendously hard on themselves, which can be actually a big shame button for them actually in bigger relationships or marriage, and can be actually something that brings people into counseling, seeking support. And luckily there are things like EMDR that can really be helpful in kind of wiping that stuff out a little bit, so it's not as much of a trigger. But also,
what's EMDR?
So EMDR, it's something that stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And in its original format, EMDR is something that was used with troops returning from war. And it's one of two things that the VA actually has approved for people for like working on PTSD. But it's something where it's like, whether it's bullying or whatever has happened to someone in life, it's a really interesting tool, and it can be really helpful to quickly clear out something that's been problematic for people, whether it is something like PTSD or something like bullying or just things that tend to be buttons. And it's interesting to see how that comes up. Like I had an ADHD adult that came into my office, and he came in and we ended up finding a target for EMDR because he was like, my wife and I are fighting constantly. Every week, divorce is being brought up. This is my second marriage. I really don't want to go on to a third one. What can you do to help me? And so we ended up going and we saw some different signs of something that we could target with a treatment plan for EMDR. We focused on that. And it was fascinating because he came back to me after we had finished with that 6 months later. And he was like, I never thought I would say this, but I haven't had a fight with my wife in 6 months. And it's that reminder of there are these really impressive tools that are out there, whether it be finding a good marriage counselor to be able to help, to be able to get both people, on the same page, communicating in a better way that helps the structural solvency of their relationship and understanding and connecting to each other. Because sometimes it is just something of where people are encoding different things that are happening in the relationship one way, and it's totally different than each other is seeing it, and trying to bridge those different gaps and find ways to then get back to kind of the core of what's good in that relationship and give them tools to be able to make, a positive and lasting relationship last.
I think all of us would benefit in this life from adopting Hanlon's razor a little bit more frequently and quickly and easily. In other words, when you don't understand why something's happened or something that isn't as you expected or as you wanted it happen, it's probably because of ignorance, not because of malice. And it seems like nowadays everybody's forgotten the all or nothing fallacy. So if something happens on the news, everybody who's even remotely similar to this poor bastard is also a terrible person. If you voted this way, prayed this way, came from this particular country, live in this particular city, you're just terrible and awful, like all the like the other guy who came from there. If you're a police officer, you're a crooked, corrupt, horrible person. And that is like the first rule of logical fallacy is, look, it's almost never all or nothing. There's always a gray area. And it seems to me if we could start saying to even people who aren't neurodivergent, hey, look, you just said something that was crossways. You said something I didn't understand. You just did something that's kind of off. Instead of making a broad assumption about how terrible a person you are, or indeed how wonderful a person you are, because I'm going to sweep all this under the carpet because I'm looking at you in this idealistic light. We need more conversation. We need more, hey, how are you feeling right now? What is it you're thinking? Not like, what were you thinking per se, but obviously that would be kind of confrontational. But just have a little bit more understanding that people, not even in the largesse of politics and religion in the news media, are going to think differently than we are, but they may respond differently to, would you like to go get a coffee, than we would have expected them to. And that seems to me the key for processing this cute, quirky, fun, manic pixie dream girl you met, who also can't seem to give you the kind of answers you want when things get serious and doesn't even know how to get serious. Am I onto something?
I think so. I mean, I think part of what you're talking about too is compassionate communication in relationships. So for instance, somebody with ADHD that's maybe like, let's give the classic example of planning and, is something that's challenging for them. Maybe they're bad with time. So let's say that guy is going to meet some friends at night and their partner is like, oh my God, they're totally going to come home late. I'm going to get frustrated with this. They have a horrible sense of time, especially if they go and hang out with their friends. What is a way, instead of just building up kind of that, rehearsing that negative scenario of what
Bracing
may
oneself
happen.
for negativity. Yeah.
Yeah, bracing. Well, also kind of rehearsing the unfairness of this person's going to go out, they're going to stay out late, it's going to frustrate me, I'm going to be so pissed, it's going to be 11, 12 o'clock, and, I'm going to be texting them. And so you build up this whole like tension in your mind, in your body, and everything. And instead of going and looking at a solution, which could be like, hey, before you go out, can you talk to me for a second? I'm curious what time would be a good time for you to like come home. I'm not trying to put pressure on you to do what you don't want to do, but could we consciously could we agree before you even go out the door? Like, what is your goal for getting home? What's something that you're not going to be frustrated with, but we can agree on? And so let's say they say, all right, it's 11 o'clock. And then that person may be like, what's one thing that you could do to try and help yourself to then remember that your goal is to be home at 11 o'clock? And then it may be like, well, I could set a timer on my phone to then go off at that time. And then, so that way there's kind of a conscious cue that's there to try and work on that. And if there's problems, ultimately trying to look at this like any other program of like, let's debug this together. And I think it's just not viewing the person as a problem and trying to like work together towards a solution that makes sense for both. Just because ultimately that's again where I get into this mindset of, I feel like we're dealing with different operating systems and there may be similar things that these operating systems do. There are certain things that they do better than others, certain things that they may have more challenges with. So it's trying to figure out, how do we optimize this? How do we optimize this code in a way that makes sense in our unique environment?
It seems to me that it all comes down to patience. This person may be well worth my investment in a relationship, but I can't expect to have them figured out by tomorrow morning. And that might be a wonderful adventure if you'll let it. His name is William Schroeder, and he runs the Just Mind Counseling organization up in Austin, Texas. And the website is justmind.org. But of course, you also go to mountaintoppodcast.com/justmind, 8 letters, JUSTMIND, and find all about what William and his team are up to up there. And what will they find when they go to the website, William?
We have about 50 different team members. What makes us unique is most of our people have 20 to 30 years of experience. And so they're really polished. We have like 30 EMDR clinicians. We have a lot of different people that are very advanced in their studies and specializations. So whether it's OCD, autism, you name it, we can cover it. It's from, kids as young as 2 all the way through adulthood. We cover all of it. So really there's not much that we can't help with. We can cover a broad range of needs. And even, we also run the Austin Mental Health Group where there's about 3,000 therapists that are in it. So if worst came to worst and somebody had a special need, whether it be an insurance that they needed to be taken or what have you, we can find them a place to get support.
And can your team work remotely, or is it just limited to people in Austin?
So we have psychologists that can work across all boundaries. We actually have a special contract with Deloitte. So we go and we work with their employees around the country for our psychologists. For our social workers and counselors, they're limited by the state boundary with the current laws of Texas. So anywhere, and we actually serve 161 different cities in Texas.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, this has been an essential conversation, and I think it's been enlightening not only for me, but I'm sure for a lot of the guys listening, whether they're neurodivergent or they've got their eye on a cutie who is or who they suspect is. I think this is powerful stuff. Thank you for coming on, William, and we hope to have you back.
Yeah, absolutely, Scott. Anytime.
Yeah, gentlemen, check it out. I work with guys who are neurodivergent all the time. I strongly suspect that I am undiagnosed in that area. I was accused of being ADHD when I was a kid. It was ADD back then, but no one ever really tested it or anything. But I know that I can relate to a lot of this. I know I get hyper focused. I've won awards back in the sales world for being so focused and getting rid of everything around me and becoming obsessed with how to win these deals. And that worked well when I was in the business world. But I do think a lot of that hyper focus and my brain spinning around. And by the way, one of the things we didn't talk about here, but we've talked about before, is how high IQ guys also, their brains can start spinning around and around, and we can be a little quirky and different. And I've told you guys about how I worked with guys from Bell Labs for years and years who had IQs of like 180, and some of them just couldn't relate. It's a bit of a specialty of mine. If you're a guy who's high IQ and you suspect that some of this applies to you and you want to get better with women, I'm the guy to talk to. Set up that appointment from the website at mountaintoppodcast.com. And while you're there, visit also our three main longtime sponsors, Jocko Willink's company, Origin in Maine. Guys, great jeans, Jeans, unlike, Sydney Sweeney, I guess, although Jocko probably has great jeans as well. But the boots, the Bison boots, get you some, man. They're worth the investment. They're bulletproof. They'll outlast you, man. You'll wear those things for the rest of your life. And how cool is Bison leather? It just doesn't get any cooler than that. Hero soap, the scents are manly, the ingredients are pure. Get you some. The Keyport is not your grandfather's Swiss Army knife. The gadgetry that you can put on your everyday carry device is amazing nowadays, and the Keyport is world-class in that regard. Whichever one of our sponsors you work with, use the coupon code MOUNTAIN10 to get an additional 10% off. All of that and more is there for you at mountaintoppodcast.com, as always, gentlemen. And until I talk to you again real soon, this is Scott McKay from X&Y Communications in San Antonio, Texas. Be good out there.
The Mountaintop Podcast is produced by X&Y Communications. All rights reserved worldwide. Be sure to visit www.mountaintoppodcast.com for show notes. And while you're there, sign up for the free X&Y Communications newsletter for men. This is Ed Roy Odom speaking for the Mountaintop Podcast.